Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Evan Stankovic, Adult Programming Librarian at the Northside Library. And on behalf of the Jefferson-Madison Regional Library System, welcome to the virtual presentation. It has been a tough 17 months managing stress and mental health in the pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please do remember to keep checking jmrl.org for a complete and frequently updated schedule of virtual and in-person programs for all ages. Tonight's event and all JMRL events have been made possible by the incredible and generous support of the Friends of the Library. This presentation is being recorded for inclusion on JMRL's YouTube channel and the library podcast on the same page. Barring any technical difficulties, we hope to have them both posted within the next few days. As a courtesy to this afternoon's presenter, mics have been muted. However, if you do have questions during the course of the program, please feel free to type them into the chat box or the Q&A box. Or if you do want to ask a question out loud, please feel free to use the raise hand feature and I can unmute your microphone. Without further ado, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you this evening's presenter. Dr. Bethany Teachman is Professor of Psychology and Director of Clinical Training at the University of Virginia. Additionally, Dr. Teachman directs the Program for Anxiety, Cognition, and Treatment Lab, which investigates cognitive processes that contribute to the development and maintenance of anxiety disorders and other forms of emotion dysregulation. A sincere thank you to Dr. Teachman for taking the time to be with us here this evening and discuss managing stress and mental health in a pandemic. And with that said, I would like to turn things over to Dr. Bethany Teachman.
Thank you so much, Evan, for the invitation and for the kind introduction. And thanks for those who have joined this evening. We're a small group, so I'm very happy to keep it pretty informal. So do not hesitate to raise hand, type a question in chat. If something occurs to you, we don't need to wait to the end. So I want to make sure that we talk about the things that you most want to hear about. So as Evan said, we decided to call this, it has been a tough 17 months managing stress and mental health in a pandemic. And when Evan originally reached out to me, it seemed like this was going to be more about life post-pandemic that we'd be talking about. And of course, now as we're dealing with this sort of Delta swerve, as it's being called, there's some more ups and downs that we're going to be riding with this. And I don't think it's fair to call it post-pandemic at this point, but we can talk about how do you navigate kind of this, very challenging time. So I thought I would first just introduce some big picture ideas to kind of keep in mind as we think about managing mental health during this period. And then I picked a couple of topics that are ones I get asked about quite a lot. One is kind of dealing with low motivation, low concentration, that kind of COVID brain idea that we're sort of under this load and depleted and it's kind of hard to be at our, kind of full level of functioning, kind of how to navigate that. And then how do you sort of manage the anxiety and stress and sadness and anger and all the emotions at this time? And then we'll spend a few minutes talking about sort of when and how to get more help, and particularly in our community. And then I hope to save a fair bit of time for your questions and some of the different pieces that I won't have hit on in this initial part. So, in terms of some big picture pieces to keep in mind as we have this discussion, the first thing is to just be, open and direct that there aren't easy answers, right? So this is a marathon rather than a sprint. There isn't going to be sort of one solution that solves all of your emotional or mental health challenges or needs at this time, or needs of your family members. And so a lot of this is going to be trial and error. And a big part of it is actually recognizing that it is completely to be expected. It is natural and perfectly reasonable to be upset at times over what is going on. This has been an incredibly challenging time for a really long time. And when we sort of tell ourselves that it's not okay to be upset, it's not okay to be anxious, it's not okay to sort of be stressed, all those things, we actually tend to make those emotions a whole lot worse and more challenging to manage. So again, kind of normalizing, like, of course you feel anxious and stressed sometimes. This is an objectively challenging time, can help us to kind of navigate this. With that comes this idea that we probably need to adjust our expectations a little bit, both for ourselves and others. So, I've heard people joke that, kind of we're all kind of functioning at, maybe 80% of our usual functioning on a good day, right? And that's pretty good. So, we don't have to think of it as either we're at 0% or we're at 100%. It's not curling up in bed and doing nothing, but we also don't have to have the expectation that we're going to be at our full capacity at all times. And so having those more reasonable expectations, both for ourselves and others, and showing that compassion can really make a real difference to kind of managing this time. The other piece, to keep in mind as we, start this conversation is to really recognize that this is a really weird mix of simultaneously being a very shared experience, really across the whole globe. We're dealing with coronavirus, and many people are facing some similar threats. And at the same time, it's also something where each individual and each family and each, situation is really quite unique. We know that the impacts of this time have been really uneven and disparate, and all kinds of equity issues have arisen in terms of healthcare implications, risk of COVID threat, risk of job loss. So this is not something that has hit everybody in the same way. And that's something to really keep in mind as you're interacting with people, because each person is, navigating their own sort of set of challenges in terms of what this time has brought for them. And so it's going to require a lot of flexibility. So part of that is going to be flexibility over time, right? Especially as we're dealing with kind of, news cycle right now of sort of the increase in the Delta variant and trying to figure out what's that going to mean for our community and our work lives and our family life and all of those things. Recognizing that the decision we make today may be different than the decision we're going to need to make 1 week from now, and that we can expect that, and that's reasonable. It's going to have to be this kind of flexible, iterative process. Similarly, strategies we try to kind of navigate this time and manage our emotional and mental health are also going to need to be trial and error. So I'm going to toss a bunch of different ideas at you tied to, what the research tells us can be helpful for managing mental health, but it's not a one size fits all approach. So what I really want to suggest to people is that you try something and you monitor your mood and you monitor your functioning and your relationships and all those things and say, okay, how's this working for me? Is it helping or not? And then be ready to try something new. So it's not about kind of the one answer. Another big piece that I think is really important to keep in mind during this time, in particular, is thinking about how we respond to uncertainty. So one of the things that makes this time so hard to navigate is the sort of astonishing number of unknowns that we're dealing with, right? There's so much uncertainty tied to the variants, tied to people we're interacting with. Are they vaccinated? Are they not vaccinated? Tied to risk among different family members and people that we're with, tied to implications for your work, tied to implications for your kids' school, tied to implications for your travel plans, all kinds of things. So we're navigating a ton of uncertainty, and that is known to be a really strong predictor of anxiety, right? Because there's all these unknowns. And as human beings, we want a narrative, we want a script, we want to know kind of what's coming next. And so tolerating that uncertainty is a big part of the challenge of this time. But it's one that we can approach in kind of a thoughtful way so that it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming. So one key piece that I want to encourage people to keep in mind is the idea that uncertainty doesn't equal catastrophe. So uncertainty simply means we don't know. It doesn't mean that the worst case is going to come true. And if we can approach this from the standpoint of recognizing that we have resources to respond to the situations that we're faced with, it becomes a little bit less overwhelming. Uncertainty is only really bad if we think for sure it'll end badly, or we think there's no way we could handle the challenges that will be tossed our way. But once we recognize that we're going to take steps to try to navigate the challenges that come our way, that we don't know what's going to happen, but that doesn't mean it's going to be terrible. It becomes easier to kind of tolerate that uncertainty so that we assign different meanings to what not knowing, kind of means to us. Another big piece is to keep in mind that you want to stay connected, right? And that has a few different meanings in this case. Part of it is staying connected to other people, right? So even if we need to be socially distanced in certain times, it doesn't mean we need to be socially isolated. And it's really important that we hang on to that, because that isolation is really, really challenging for us to navigate for most of us, for our mental health. But it also means staying connected to your values, right? So figuring out who do you want to be during this time? What are the values that are important to you? How do you want to spend your time? How do you want to prioritize who you see, what you do, how you make decisions? And figuring out what values you care about most can actually make a big difference of kind of managing this time, because it helps you kind of know, oh, here's what I'm going to choose to say yes to. Here's what I'm going to choose to say no to, by trying to be consistent with those values. The other piece is to recognize that while it is absolutely true that this time is unprecedented, and Evan and I were talking about this before we started the program this evening, it is nonetheless also the case that lots of research shows us that we tend to be resilient over time. So while there are absolutely going to be huge bumps for people, there are absolutely going to be mental health implications of this time for many people, and it's a really, really difficult time to navigate. It doesn't mean it's going to feel this way forever. And we know from prior crises, from prior traumas, history has shown us that most people will be resilient. And there are things we can do to make it more likely we will be resilient during this time, even as we struggle to kind of take steps during this challenging time. So let me pause there and see if there are questions before I kind of dive in a little bit more. And Evan, I assume you'll let me know.
I will. Yep. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in, or if you want to ask your question out loud, just click the raise hand feature and I can unmute you.
Great. So when it comes to thinking about that kind of low concentration, low motivation, hard to be productive and do stuff and get started, there are a number of things that you can keep in mind that can make it easier to kind of navigate this time. First, as I talked about earlier, is setting realistic expectations. So it's easier to be motivated when you recognize that what you're trying to do is kind of be at 80% of your goals, your typical goals, recognizing that you're not coming at it with exactly the same kind of starting point. You're much more likely to actually exceed that 80% if you kind of go into it with kind of a reasonable set of goals than if you set yourself at, if I don't do it at 110%, I failed somehow. So again, start with realistic expectations, and then you'll find yourself actually able to build on that and do more and more. Another piece is to figure out your priorities. So what are the things that matter to you most, and what can you let go of a little bit, right? So it may be the case that it feels really important to you during this time to prioritize family dinners. And so you're going to make sure that that's something that you still, make a point of really doing, even when you feel tired, even when you feel kind of worn out, all of those things. That's kind of where your priority is. But maybe you're going to let go of some of the cleaning projects you would have liked to have been able to do and decide, you know what, it's okay that the closet is a disaster. It's okay that I didn't clean the garage or whatever else it happens to be. So again, recognizing that, figure out what you care about, prioritize those things, and think about what are some things that maybe you can let go of so that you don't feel like it's such a house of cards about to topple. Another really good trick to kind of manage that sort of low motivation feeling is to take big tasks and really break them into smaller steps. So, I work a lot with students as a professor at UVA. And so, if they have a big paper to do, telling yourself write the paper is actually not very motivating and feels incredibly overwhelming. However, telling yourself, okay, today I pick the topic. Tomorrow I find 3 sources to read. The next day, I read 2 of those sources and take notes on them. The next day, I do an outline of the introduction. The next day, I write 2 paragraphs of that introduction, et cetera, et cetera. So figuring out how to break big tasks into smaller steps can really help it not feel quite so overwhelming. So think about where you can start versus thinking about this whole massive thing that you have to do. For most of us, though, we respond to rewards, right? So if I have kind of a big task that I need to do, I'm going to think about, what are things that I can look forward to along the way. For some people, it's their guilty pleasure TV show that they let themselves watch. For others, it's the ice cream that they decide to go and get. Whatever is the thing that for you, you're going to look forward to a little bit. My daughter knows me well, and at the beginning of COVID, she made me a jar that says Mom's Happy Bites, and it's just full of candy. And so when I am feeling low motivation and need a little all right, if I can write these 2 paragraphs, I'm going to think about something fun that I'll look forward to. So again, thinking about those small rewards along the way, not just at the sort of very end, can make it easier to feel like, okay, let me just take this step. That doesn't feel quite so difficult to do. One of the hardest ones, but one of the best things you can do is actually just start even when you're not motivated. And I know that sounds a little bit paradoxical, but I think that we are given some faulty impressions in the, from the media and TV shows and things like that. This idea that I have to, build my self-esteem and build my motivation, and then I'll go out and do it. In fact, it doesn't tend to work that way. The research says that it's much more likely that you take a step and then you go, oh, I can do something. Okay, well, now I feel a little better about myself. Now I feel a little better about taking another step. Now I'm more motivated to take that next step. So actually picking one small step that you can do and going for that is much more likely to increase your motivation and lead to more steps than kind of waiting for this magical perfect time. Because if you're like me and most people, you're going to keep waiting, right? Because there isn't this magical time where you're like, now I'm really ready. Now I can do it and take on the world. So instead, figure out what is that small step you can do even when you don't feel like it. And that will help you to start feeling more like it and feeling more able to take more steps. Another piece that can help as you try to think about sort of managing this time and the changes we're dealing with is to set routines, right? So especially if you're a person who's still in a situation of working remotely or in a situation where you're not kind of back to kind of more regular, whatever regular life means at this point, figuring out like, where do I go when I'm trying to work or be productive? How do I want to structure my time? What is that going to look like? And kind of creating those routines can really make a big difference. So sort of saying, okay, this is the place I go, even if I live in a small place. This is the part of the room I sit in when I'm working, and this is the part of the room I sit in when I'm relaxing, and whatever it happens to be. But having those routines can be a really good cue for you to kind of help get started in those situations. Another piece is trying to look overall at the balance of kind of how you've set up your day and how you've set up your week. It doesn't have to be necessarily all at the day level, but across a week, you really want to be able to look and see, okay, did I have things, activities planned that were about being productive? Doesn't have to be your job necessarily. Some people are working, some people aren't, but things that make me feel productive as a human being, meeting my goals, whatever they happen to be. Do I have things that are about having fun? Do I have things that are more on the relaxing side? Do I have things that are more active, exercise, getting me outside, all those kinds of things? Do I have social things, whether it's, in person or virtual or whatever it's going to be? Am I having that mix, that balance of different types of activities that will help meet different needs? We know that when people kind of have a better balance, it's easier for them to kind of feel motivated because they're getting more kind of sense that, oh, things feel good that I'm doing. I'm not just meeting one kind of need, but meeting a wide variety of my needs. And again, that makes it easier to then actually do more when you feel like that range of needs are being met. The other piece is kind of something I alluded to with the kind of big picture ideas of kind of thinking about what your values and goals are and trying to be consistent with that. It's much easier to be motivated when you feel like you are doing something that is consistent with your values and your goals. And so with that, we can think about, we want to do things that kind of feel rewarding for us, but that doesn't just mean that it's fun or pleasurable. Something can be rewarding also because we've defined it as helping to meet our values or helping to meet our goals. And so there's a lot of ways that we can kind of think about getting there. I see we have a question in chat. I believe this will be available to watch later. It's being recorded and will be posted, I believe. Thank you for that question. So let me pause here and see if there are other questions tied to this area of kind of thinking about your concentration and your motivation and kind of how to get started on things. So I'll pause a second and just see if any questions come in there. I apologize. I had a loud dog in the background for just a moment here. Oh, all right. Let me go ahead then, and I'll keep us moving. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some strategies you can think about to manage kind of COVID-linked anxiety and stress during this time. And there are lots in this category, so I just picked a few to kind of focus on today, but feel free, as I said, to jump in with questions or things that might fit your particular situation. So the first one is to kind of think about limiting your media exposure to COVID-19 stories. I put COVID-19 kind of into parentheses there because really COVID-19 is not the only area where we have lots of stressful stories. So whether it's tied to climate change, whether it's tied to racial injustice, whether it's tied to some of the political challenges, there are all kinds of stories that are sort of keeping us up at night right now and that are pretty challenging to navigate. And so thinking about kind of not getting stuck in that doom scrolling idea is actually pretty important for kind of managing stress and anxiety during this time. We know from studies that have looked at kind of like predictors of post-traumatic stress symptoms following trauma and things like that. If people are being just kind of inundated all the time with kind of threatening information, not surprisingly, it makes you feel really threatened, and it can be very hard to kind of have chances for that kind of natural recovery mechanisms to kick in that situation. So I recommend, pick a couple times a day where you choose to kind of read reliable, trusted sources, get the information you need so you can take the appropriate precautionary steps and all those kinds of things, be informed. But don't do that kind of nonstop scrolling of, one bad story to another bad story going on, because it puts your mind in this sort of state of perpetual threat. And that's pretty hard to not feel overwhelmed when you're in that situation. Another piece to keep in mind is this idea of like problem solving versus panicking, right? So follow health recommendations from reliable sources, but we want to avoid that kind of, the Delta variant is here. I better go get the 50 rolls of toilet paper. I better go stock up on whatever. I better stop seeing any human beings outside of my home, sort of the really kind of extreme versions of it. And so thinking about, okay, what are the challenges? What do I need to navigate? What will kind of make progress on those challenges? Absolutely. Ask yourself those questions. But when you find yourself stuck in that loop and going to kind of these big extremes, that's probably a sign that you're going to that more kind of catastrophic thing or that more kind of panic mode. So choosing those kind of reliable sources that you trust, whether that be CDC or whatever else, as your news sources, as the places where you get guidance and information, and then following those makes a lot of sense. And so we want to think about, it's kind of like this Goldilocks thing of like not doing too much in terms of precautions, and then of course not doing too little, but finding that sweet spot. So, because I work with folks who have anxiety and may sometimes have those more extreme reactions, I hear about stories of people washing their hands with bleach and things like that are really not recommended. So washing your hands with soap, absolutely, but going to those extreme levels can actually be dangerous in and of themselves. So we want to think about, again, problem solving rather than panicking. A good kind of clue to tell you like, hey, where am I on that continuum, is to see whether you're kind of getting new information in your kind of searches, or whether you're just kind of going over the same scary stuff over and over and over again. If it's not new information, it's not very helpful for you. So again, we want to move away from that kind of panic mode into more of that problem solving mode. Choose your times where you're going to kind of work on those pieces, but at other times, you want to have as much normal life as you can, as much enjoying things, all the things that make you feel kind of healthy and normal, and like things are not completely in upheaval. So with that is the idea of challenging catastrophic thinking, right? So we've talked a little bit about this, but it's the idea that it's much easier to navigate this time if we can think about it as a collective challenge, right? So it is something that is hard, is difficult, asks a lot of us, but if we were all do our part to kind of manage it, it is a challenge that we will be able to manage. It's very different than thinking of it as kind of this individual insurmountable threat that you alone kind of need to navigate. If we can have that sense of kind of approaching it as a community, as a collective challenge, it's a whole lot easier. The other piece about kind of avoiding that catastrophic thinking is regularly asking yourself, is there another perspective? Is there another way that I can think about this? Is there another way that I think, oh, wow, how might, somebody I trust kind of think about this situation? What might I say to a friend in this situation? Are there other ways that I can kind of think about this rather than jumping to the worst conclusion and assuming the worst situation, right? Another piece is recognizing that social distancing should not equal social isolation. And I really can't stress this enough. This is a really hard time, and dealing with it completely alone is really, really tough. And so while there may be things that we need to shift, even at this time, as we're kind of dealing with the variants and some of the ongoing challenges, we still don't want to be socially isolated, right? We still want to think about what are the safe ways we can have those social connections, the safe ways we can feel still supported by the people in our lives and really nurture those relationships. Because it will be very hard to kind of navigate your emotional health if you're not kind of doing that piece. And this seems like really basic, but self-care actually matters quite a bit. So, eating regular, healthy meals, sleeping enough, getting regular exercise, watching for an increase in unhealthy behaviors, right? So watching for an increase in alcohol or other substances, that basic stuff of self-care, what it does is kind of put you in a better position to manage the stresses, right? It's kind of like a buffer that sort of says, okay, I've got a decent amount of resources and capacity available so that I can navigate the challenges that are going to come my way during this time. There are going to be tough choices to make. There are going to be challenges during this time. That's the reality of it. So put yourself in a position to be better able to respond to those challenges by taking decent care of yourself in those basic ways. Let me pause for a minute and see if there's any questions kind of tied to that piece before I move on. And please don't be shy. There are no dumb questions here. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about kind of when and how to get other kinds of help. So I'm often asked, so how do you know if like you or someone you care about should get help? And there's no magic answer, although I would say if you're asking that question, get an evaluation. It doesn't hurt to kind of get some feedback. But let me give you a few kind of cues or clues you can use to kind of help guide decision making. One are if you find that the anxiety or sadness or whatever symptoms you're dealing with are really persistent, that's an important clue that you might want to get some additional kind of help and resources on board. So if you find that you're anxious just when you're kind of reading the news and kind of catching up and hearing about the latest on the Delta variant or whatever it happens to be, but at most times you get to enjoy your day, you're still functioning pretty well in your job, all those kinds of things, and it's not kind of wrecking time with others, okay, sounds like that's pretty normative levels of anxiety. If, on the other hand, it's really persisting and you're finding that it is pervasive, so it's affecting a lot of areas of your life, that's a sign that it's getting to be more challenging. So not only are you anxious when you're reading the news, but you're really anxious when you're hanging out with, your significant other or your friend at the end of the day. And it feels like you don't even get to relax or enjoy those times, even when you're doing activities that are kind of objectively okay and things like that. It's still that anxiety, that stress is really interfering. Or if you find that there's a lot of impairment, right? So if your experience is such that you're really not able to kind of do your job very well. You're a student and you're getting behind in classes. You're a caregiver and it feels incredibly hard to kind of navigate the caregiving that you need to do to give the supports that the person needs, all those kinds of things. If you are feeling like this is really getting in the way of your functioning and kind of meeting your potential, don't wait, get some help. And fortunately, there are a lot of sort of things that you can access that can be helpful. A lot of good resources. So the first thing is to highlight telehealth, right? So that's when people are doing therapy or other kinds of mental health services, either like this over Zoom or over the phone. There's a bunch of different ways that people can do it. I've put 2 national organizations' websites there so you can find, providers that can help with that. ADA is the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and ABCT is the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. Both of them have nice resources for finding help. You'll want to look for resources if you're local in the state of Virginia, because there's different laws about being treated in other states and things like that. But there's really a lot of help that's out there. And one of the things that's nice to know is that the research actually shows us that telehealth can get just as good results as doing therapy in person. So I'm doing therapy this way with my clients right now. There's a lot of ways that we can still make sure we're delivering services to people who need them. There's also a lot of great self-help books and things like that that have good strategies and workbooks and things like that that you can work through if you feel like you want a little extra help, but maybe don't need a therapist or counselor in the situation. Those same websites have some nice listings of good resources based on different topics and ages and all those kinds of things. The other thing is to think about digital resources. So the COVID Coach app is put out by the VA, but can be useful for people in lots of different situations and just provide sort of evidence-based approaches of like, how can you navigate stress and some of the challenges during this time. More generally, there are tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of mental health websites and apps. The problem is there's so many of them, it can be very hard to kind of figure out like which ones are based on kind of good science, which ones are decent, which ones have good privacy protections, what do you want to trust, all that kind of stuff. So I recommend going to onemindcyberguide.org. If you type just I put the short version in there, it'll redirect you. It has really nice reviews of lots of different mental health websites and apps to kind of help you choose like which ones should you trust, which ones do you think are kind of reasonable ones to go for. So it rates them and has experts rate them on things like how good are their privacy protections, how much are they based on kind of solid science and research, how easy are they to use and kind of, user friendly and all that kind of stuff. So again, there's some that have some pretty good support that they can be really helpful. And what's nice about those kind of programs is they're sort of available to you when and where you need them, as opposed to kind of having a set time for an appointment or something like that. Also a program that our team directs through UVA is called Mind Trails, and it's specifically designed to help people kind of shift that catastrophic thinking. So that tendency when there's some unknowns to kind of help people not automatically jump to that kind of worst case scenario, but to instead think more flexibly and consider different ways of kind of thinking about situations. The other thing that's important is to have the access to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Again, obviously that's a 24/7 line. NAMI.org also has lots of good resources. Particularly, it has resources that are targeted towards populations that are often unserved, and thinking about how can you find culturally competent and culturally informed care for different populations. And so that's a great place to go and look for lots of different resources. The other thing to recognize is there's a lot locally. So if you go to the Virginia Department of Health, COVID-19 kind of local resources, there are all kinds of information that you can find there, both in the kind of mental health arena, but also lots of practical support. So if you're dealing with food insecurity, if you're dealing with, job loss issues, if you're dealing with all physical health issues, there's tons of resources that are available, including distress lines and all kinds of places to get information. So I really encourage people not to kind of stay struggling, but to think about how can they reach out and kind of access more help.
Dr. Teachman, can I jump in? We have a question that was posed
Please.
a few moments ago. What is the best way to deal with loved ones who are anti-vaxxers or who buy into conspiracy theories without getting into an argument or getting frustrated?
Yeah, it's really hard. So I'll be honest, I don't have a perfect answer. It's something that researchers are desperately trying to figure out right now and understand better what are the best ways. That said, we do know some things. So one thing that we know is that when we are trying to talk to somebody who has a really different position than us, being really confrontational, argumentative, defensive, all those things is very unlikely to be successful. Instead, expressing empathy, trying to understand the person's perspective, asking them what's guiding their thinking, and recognizing a little bit kind of where they're coming from is much more likely to be successful. So when people feel like, not that you're agreeing with them, but that you see them as a human being who's kind of trying to figure it out too, you're much more likely to be successful in kind of introducing kind of new ideas and having a little bit of perspective taking that goes both ways. So specific to these issues of thinking about people who are, against getting a vaccine or who may believe conspiracy theories and things like that, one of the things that people recommend is like acknowledge the losses that people are dealing with why is it that, wearing a mask or getting a vaccine feels really challenging or threatening to them? Try to understand where they're coming from and acknowledge that there may be hard parts for them of doing that, as opposed to just saying, okay, you're being an idiot, all of those kinds of things that you may feel like you want to say, but probably won't be very helpful. Instead, again, showing that empathy, showing that compassion, acknowledging that there are hard parts from their perspective may make it easier. The other thing is, instead of trying to, do a tough sell and convince people, when you have an opening, when they're open to hearing it and saying they're, not sort of doing this to you, just expressing your experience can be really helpful, as opposed to saying, let me convince you and tell you how you're wrong. Just saying, here's how I kind of made those choices. Here's why I chose to do it for my family. And yeah, I was nervous about it at the beginning too, but here's what I learned that was kind of helpful for me. And again, doing it in a way that is a little bit less defensive, a little bit less threatening, can be really helpful. So that's one category of sort of, suggestions that the research tells us is, again, instead of doing the shove it down your throat, doing the perspective taking and empathy approach is more likely to be successful. The other is to draw from a line of research for a treatment that's called motivational interviewing. So it is a form of treatment that's used a lot when people are maybe stuck doing a behavior that's not very healthy for them, but they have a lot of ambivalence about changing. So substance use, for example. So this type of treatment is used a lot when people are starting to get treatment for, alcohol use or drug use or things like that. And what it does is it's a kind of framework or way of thinking that says, I recognize that you have a lot of ambivalence about making change. And instead of judging a person for having ambivalence, it says, that's pretty natural. Like, it's what you know, right? And we're asking you to think about doing something that kind of goes against what's familiar to you, what's known to you, and that's hard. And so when we acknowledge that that's hard, and instead just kind of have a discussion with people that sort of says, let's talk about the different sides of this. Let's talk about what you might gain if you were to get vaccinated, if you were to think about this in a different way, if you were to let go of some of the ideas that have been driving the ways you've been responding, what would look differently in your life? So in doing that, what we're trying to do is develop some discrepancy between where people are now and kind of where they hope to get to. So sometimes we'll ask questions like, what do you see yourself doing 6 months from now? What do you want that to look like? Okay, you want to be going to parties, you want to be doing those things. What would it take to get there? What would it take to be able to do those things that meet your goals? So if we can help people see that there's a discrepancy between kind of their desired goals and things they want to do that are consistent with their values and where they are now, that can help make it easier for people to move. So again, we're moving away from the kind of argument place, because if I go here and push hard, your only option is to go there. Instead, what we want to do is align with people and say, help me understand this from your perspective, and then to try to help them with talking it through. Another piece is kind of recognizing it's unlikely to be one conversation. So when I do motivational interviewing with people who have a lot of ambivalence about making changes, about reducing their drinking, about any kind of healthy behavior change that we're hoping they're going to do, it's very rarely one conversation, right? It's kind of planting seeds, exploring it, recognizing that resolving ambivalence isn't going to happen in an instant. It's not typically an epiphany. It's kind of slowly building that sense of, I can make a change. I want to make a change. A change will be beneficial in my life. And there are steps to get there. But if we start with just the steps, we're missing that critical piece about building that person's kind of motivation to help address the ambivalence that they are naturally feeling. So let me pause. I've thrown a lot at you. Great question that was raised. Did I answer the question or any follow-up that the person has? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Evan.
Oh, nope, sorry. I'm muted myself by accident.
You're good. Okay. So actually that's a really nice lead in. I mean, the question was particularly about kind of the dealing with people who are, against getting a vaccine or have a different perspective than you do on kind of how to navigate this time. That leads actually well into kind of thinking about how do we help others more generally. And I want to talk a bit about this because it is something I'm asked about a lot because one of the things that's really hard about so many people struggling with mental health issues during this time is that all of us have people who we care deeply about, who we are seeing struggle right now. And that's really, really hard to watch and to feel sometimes helpless of like, what do we do? How do we help? And so let me give you some strategies there. Again, going back to that very first thing I said of there are no simple answers here. This is about trial and error and having a broad toolbox of kind of things that you can use to kind of approach these challenging situations. So this is thinking less about the kind of anti-vax kind of situation and more about when people are dealing with significant mental health challenges. So maybe there's somebody in your family who's dealing with depression. Maybe there's a coworker who you care a lot about. And you think, whoa, this person's really, really anxious. What can you do? So a few suggestions to kind of have in mind. One is to think about reaching out. So to raise the topic of saying, hey, just want to check in and kind of see how you're doing. I know it's a tough time and I've been thinking about you and kind of wondered how it's going. So to take that step and kind of create the opening and to think that have an approach of kind of you're there to listen and to not shut down the conversation. So sometimes, especially when we're talking to kids or adolescents, they may not be ready to kind of have that full conversation at the outset. That's okay. What you're trying to do is create some openings for people so that when they're ready to talk, they recognize that you're a person who's ready to listen. Another thing that you can do is to normalize and empathize, right? So that is recognizing that, again, when someone tells us that they're struggling, that they're anxious, depressed, whatever it happens to be, not doing the, oh my God, you're what? But to sort of say, yeah, it's a really hard time. Like, I get that. I understand. And I know a lot of people are struggling right now. And to empathize and to say, yeah, you're dealing with some pretty tough stuff. And I'm sorry that it's hurting. And I'm sorry that it's hard. Tell me about it. How can I help? So again, that normalizing, that empathizing can be really helpful. Practicing that language, right? Doesn't have to be perfect. It's okay to be a little bit awkward. Still putting yourself out there, trying to make the connection can be really helpful. So a person doesn't feel like they have to grapple alone. Another piece is to keep in mind that often our role is to provide support without necessarily fixing it. So, everybody's different, but I will tell you, I have a hugely strong, like, I need to fix this kind of mode, right? You tell me a problem, great, let me try to solve it for you. And sometimes I really have to remind myself that this is a situation where I need to give a person a hug. I need to listen. I need to just sit with them. I need to, whatever it happens to be. Maybe I need to just distract them, say, hey, let's go do something fun. But I can provide support without necessarily fixing it. Because the reality is a lot of the challenges that people are dealing with right now don't have easy fixes, right? So when people have lost their jobs, when people have loved ones who are sick, when people have economic challenges, when people are, dealing with all kinds of worries and real challenges in their lives, we can't necessarily fix it, but we can still be an important support for that person. And so really asking yourself what you can and can't offer is a really important thing, because figuring out those boundaries will actually make you better able to help somebody. And then you can help connect them to other resources, right? So go back to that earlier slide, there's a lot that's out there for people. So you don't have to be somebody's therapist. If you're not trained to do that, you probably shouldn't be. It's not a good role for you. But maybe you can say, hey, I know this great website, abct.org, where you can find a therapist who can do telehealth right now. You can help connect them to those resources without necessarily being the person who has to fix it. Helping to connect them to social supports, whether that's saying, you and saying, hey, you want to go for a walk this weekend? You want to do something? All of those kinds of things, or helping them to connect with others can really make a big difference, because managing this time alone, as I said, is not just hard for you, it's hard for other people as well. Another piece that is good for you, but also good for helping others, in your family or in your circle that you're worried about, is kind of planning nice time together and celebrating small victories. We need stuff to look forward to. It cannot be just doom and gloom and threat and scary and all those kinds of things. We've had a curveball, right? So many of us kind of thought, okay, we're mostly over this and returning to normal life. And then there's all these challenges with variants and all kinds of things that have made people say, whoa, maybe we're not as far along as we thought. Nonetheless, we need to plan nice time together. We need to plan things that we will look forward to. And again, recognizing, like, celebrate steps. You don't have to celebrate just the big giant things. So when you get through a challenging work week, like, binge watch that show, whatever is the thing that makes you feel like, okay, I did it. Plan something fun, celebrate, get the small victories along the way, not just the big things. Another big thing is to think about planning alternatives for canceled events. So, some people are kind of dealing with a second round of, or maybe fourth round at this point, of cancellations of things that we thought we were going to be able to do that maybe we're not going to be able to do. For me, it was a conference coming up that I'm no longer going to plan to attend because of, concerns that I have about how the variant is spreading in this particular location. But what else can I do? So what did I want to get out of that conference? Well, I wanted to connect with colleagues and talk about work that I'm passionate about and that they're passionate about. Okay, what else can I do to get those same benefits? How can I plan an alternative? So I'm going to plan a virtual cocktail hour where we meet and talk about some of those same things we would have talked about at the conference. So again, it's not perfect, would have rather gone, but can we think about alternatives? And it can be for something, small, like the canceled book group meeting, to something big, like, whatever it happens to be in your personal circumstances. But again, think of it as postponement and think about what else can we do to at least partly meet some of the needs that those events were going to fill. Remind other people that you work through challenges together. So this can be particularly helpful, especially when you're talking to kids. And they are anxious and they're going to pick up on our anxiety and all those things, reminding them that even though there's parts that are hard right now and things that they can do and things that they can't do, that you're a family and you work through challenges together and that they're not going to be alone in needing to kind of figure this out. Probably the most important thing, though, that probably I should have put first rather than near the end of this list, is to ask what they need. Right. So many of us, myself very much included, make assumptions about what other people need. Oh, they want to have this fun activity. Oh, they want to do this thing. Oh, we think we have the solutions for people. The truth is we're not in somebody else's head. And so instead saying, hey, how can I be helpful right now? What do you need? And actually listening to their answer can really go a long way. The last piece I'll say on this, and then I'll pause for questions tied to this, is to kind of recognize that we're not going to do it perfectly. So when we are under stress, when we are depleted, when we are exhausted, when we are overwhelmed by extra work responsibilities or whatever else it happens to be, we will make mistakes. We will say things that we regret. We will snap at people. We will lose it. We will yell. We will do all kinds of things. Have some passion for yourself. Have some compassion for the other people. Say you're sorry and move on, because it's inevitably going to happen.